Greetings, everyone. It's a delight to welcome you to the second panel of our second day. And to introduce our illustrious speaker, Federico Testa, we have Alida Metcalf, who is a professor in the Department of History and a jack of many trades. So thank you, Alida, for being here. Unfortunately, Hernani Chavez cannot be here, so we will have ample room for discussion and get back on schedule. So, hooray. Thank you, Alida.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to chair this session on norms. And I want to give a special bem-vindo to all the Brazilians who are here. That's wonderful. We have one speaker, Federico Testa, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the French department in the University of Bristol. And his work focuses on the problem of normativity, as he seeks to provide an account of agency based on a critical philosophy of norms. With training in philosophy, social sciences, and visual arts, Testa is particularly concerned with issues related to norms and critique in different domains of experience, from politics to health, passing through artistic creation and aesthetics. His recent monograph on the politics of the living discusses the work of Foucault and Canguilhem, opening the problem of life and the normative grounds of social criticism in order to reflect on biopolitical resistance. As I mentioned, he's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bristol. He's writing a new book on Georges Canguilhem, and he is drawing on extensive unpublished archival material, which I'm sure Nikki is thrilled about. He's also interested in ancient philosophy and its modern and contemporary receptions. Formerly, he was a postgraduate fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, and also an early career fellow and an associate fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at the University of Warwick, as well as a postdoctoral research fellow at PUC Rio de Janeiro and a visiting scholar at NYU. So as you can see, he's taught in many different universities in Brazil, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Please welcome Federico Testa.
Thanks very much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. I will thank Nikki, my friend Nikki Clemens, for organizing this amazing event. And, you know, I couldn't be more grateful for all the generosity and hospitality that she's been treating us with. And, you know, thank you to everyone who's here, to everyone who spoke before. You know, you've all basically ruined my talk. I'm not going to be saying anything new, but hopefully I'll be, in a way, at least providing some kind of version of what we've been discussing. So my paper is entitled Foucault's Art of Listening, Revisiting the Problem of Normativity and Critique. In debates concerning the critical intent of Foucault's project, the notions of norm and normativity have been seen with suspicion and critical distance, often appearing linked to descriptions of the ways in which power and governmental practices operate. The norm would be the main cog in the machinery of modern power, and normativity, commentators have stated, would amount to systems of norms by which we are governed. The same suspicion appears in Foucault's approach to what we could call a positive view of the norm, forms of criticism that would pose positive norms for the organization of social life, or step into the realm of prescription, providing specific programs of social transformation, or what critical theorists called normative grounds for social practices. A clear example of this suspicion appears in Foucault's 71 debate with Noam Chomsky. Thanks, Daniel. In this context, not only does Foucault attack the oppressive functioning of power in our societies using a strikingly Marxist language, speaking of pouvoir de classe and régime de dictature de classe, but is also concerned with the potentially dangerous, oppressive, and normalizing effects of prescription. Chomsky, on the other hand, argues for the elimination of all forms of coercion, repression and control that can be intrinsically or rationally justified. But understanding the arbitrary nature of these relations for Chomsky is not enough. One should, as Daniel said, also propose an image, a vision of a future society, a future just society, in such a way that this very notion of justice could ground critique and political action. Only through this notion could ground critique and political action. But the notion of justice can only be articulated, in turn, in what Chomsky calls, or through what he calls, a humanitarian social theory, founded upon a solid conception of human nature, whose fundamental attributes a just society would foster and allow to flourish. Foucault, however, sees this reference to a pre-established ideal image of a future society precisely one of the dangers, or maybe temptations, in relation to existing theory, in relation to existing social practices. Chomsky's reference to human nature as a guiding principle for the organization of the new order, is still a product of our own time, and its regimes of power knowledge, government, and veridiction. Foucault says, I quote, "You can't prevent me from believing that these notions of human nature, of justice, of the realization of the human essence, are all concepts that have been formed within our civilization, within the type of knowledge, savoir, and our form of philosophy, and that as a result are part of our class system. One cannot, however regrettable this may be, put forward these notions to describe or justify a fight that should overthrow the very foundations of this society." End of quote. So as you can see, and here I echo Judith's talk yesterday, the very concepts that would allow for a radical reorganization of society risk carrying with them, due to their historical and epistemic situatedness, the structures and presuppositions of our own society. Prescriptive critique faces the problem of what Paulvain illustrated with the image of the bocal, the historical fishbowl in which we swim, right? And the limits of our historical conditions of possibility in our time. Thus, pre-establishing what a future society would look or should look like would risk perpetuating the forms of oppression linked to the a priori of the present one, of our bocal, right? In this sense, in the same way that for Foucault, there can be no prescriptive value in crystallized images of the past. I've been trying to show this in my work on Foucault and ancient philosophy and Foucault and Pierre Hadot. Also, positive visions of the future cannot guarantee the elimination of present forms of oppression, precisely due to this epistemic circularity. Nevertheless, in its effort not to function normatively, Foucault's work would end up, and I quote Nancy Fraser, inviting questions it is not equipped to answer. Although Foucault presents his work as a toolbox for resistance and counterpower, it is not clear, Fraser argues, why struggle is preferable to submission and why domination ought to be resisted. For her, only with the introduction, I quote, of normative notions could Foucault begin to answer these questions, end quote. Similarly, Habermas, for Habermas, there is an inconsistency in Foucault's exclusion of the normative and prescriptive stances and his insistence in the critical role of genealogy. In the philosophical discourse of modernity, Habermas criticizes Foucault for having proposed three forms of reduction. The first, a reduction to the understanding of meaning of social practices by participants to an explanation of discursive structures that are meaningless in themselves. Second reduction, the reduction of validity claims to mere effects of power, which would lead us, as Federico was saying yesterday, to relativism. And third, the reduction of the ought to the is. That is to say, value judgments and the problem of justifying critique, Habermas says, are excluded in favor of a value-free historical explanation and what would be an ascetic description of practices of power. If elsewhere, Habermas raises the suspicion of Foucault's thought being fundamentally conservative, in the philosophical discourse of modernity, he acknowledges Foucault's aim of offering resources for challenging technologies of power. Thus, Habermas suggests, if we consider Foucault's work as critical, we must also admit it is crypto-normative. that is to say, marked by the arbitrary partisanship of a criticism that cannot account for its normative foundations. But isn't it possible that Foucault's approach is both non-normative and critical at the same time? We could think, for instance, that instead of positing universal norms, it would rather seek to make visible, and here I'm echoing the discussion about light, lumière, yesterday with Ariana, the norms through which we are governed. So making those norms visible and showing how these norms are embedded in modern institutions. So in Discipline and Punish, for example, Foucault writes, in order for power to be exercised, power requires instruments capable of making visible its field and objects of application while making itself invisible. Critique could then consist in disrupting this economy of light, inverting the vector of visibility, exposing the hidden machinery of the norms that govern our conduct, thus undermining their efficacy and creating a potential critical space between social actors and the norms they perform. Moreover, commentators have indicated a careful description of the realm of the functioning of institutions also entails a comparison to these institutions' stated oughts, their aims. So instead of proposing norms and assessing institution in relation to these norms, Foucault's description invites us to compare what the institutions do to what they say they do. So think of the humanization of punishment and Discipline and Punish. Think of the humanization of the treatment of the mad with Pinel and Tuque and the History of Madness. It seems as if, as Arnold Davidson said of Primo Levi, that Foucault is inviting us to exercise judgment and inviting ourselves to be the judges of these institutions. Nevertheless, even if these descriptions appear in their critical import, we are once again or still confronted with Fraser's discomforting question. Why? And this is a very discomforting question for me. Why should we expose the sound functioning of norms rather than continuing to perform them? It is here that I think a detour via Canguilhem can be of help. In The Normal and the Pathological, Canguilhem writes that by normative in philosophy, one understands, I quote, all the judgment that appreciates or qualifies a fact in relation to a norm. End quote. To this, we could add the reference to the realm of oughts, of rational justification underlying the conformity to a rule, or the modalities of constraint linked to prescriptive systems. In addition to the mode of evaluation referring fact to value, normativity is also often associated with the mode of existence of rules and our adherence to them. But these understandings of normativity, Canguilhem thinks, are derivative. They rely or are subordinated to that, and I quote, that which institutes norms. In the full sense of the term, Canguilhem says, normative is that which institutes norms. And it is in this sense that he speaks of a vital or biological normativity. Living beings, he explains, are defined by the capacity to posit norms, and to speak of life means referring to norms, what Guillaume Leblanc called binôme norme-vie. To explain the emergence of norms and the functioning of normativity, Canguilhem makes recourse to a more fundamental concept that he calls vital polarity. According to him, all living forms, even the simplest ones, even the amoeba, he says, is constantly engaged in processes of selection, preference, and exclusion. The way in which it orients itself in the environment is axiologically structured, and is structured by this polar distinction of positive and negative values. And the former could be said to be the persistence and expansion in life. And this is Canguilhem's words, by the way. I'm not here just channeling Spinoza. And on the other end, death as the ultimate value of negative values, right? Ultimately, the polarity of a negative value is expressed in death. These two possibilities function as axiological poles. And life, as Canguilhem writes, is polarity, unconscious position of value, and normative activity, and thus never indifferent to its conditions of existence. Now, to the challenges posed by situations experienced as negative in this polarity, the living posits norms, established schemas of response, modalities of behavior, grids of interpretation of phenomena, stabilized constants and structures or in a word, if you will, ways of life. Norms are always contingent responses and therefore context-bound. Canguilhem also proposes a detailed and elaborate discussion of the relation between vital and social norms, which I unfortunately cannot explore here. Read my book. It is nevertheless important to say that the phenomenon of social normativity is tightly linked to the capacity of the living human being to create norms of life, create shared norms of life. However, and roughly put, if the organism can be defined as a unified whole in terms of its normative activity, so biological entities, right? Society, on the other hand, is always fragmented. It's always marked by divergent and conflicting norms. And thus, when we talk about social norms, we're talking about things that should be learned, proposed, incorporated by agents in the process, in the social process. So because of this, society is the seat of different normative agencies, Canguilhem explains, that are proposing different norms, right? And even if just a single individual refuses to perform a norm, this is enough for that norm to be deemed, to be said as not being the norm of a whole society. In this perspective, social conflict then is always a conflict of norms. So not only a counterposition to a norm, but it's a conflict between two norms or two normative orders or two normative agencies, right? I hope that's clear. Okay, so that was it for Canguilhem. Now back to Foucault. The first way I think Canguilhem's framework opens up a different understanding of the functioning of critique in Foucault is that of what I like to call a pragmatics of the norm, quoting Foucault's expression, pragmatics of the self in 83, the government of self and others. That is to say, pragmatics of the norm, an inquiry on the plurality of ways in which human beings put norms to action, append them to their conduct, and internalize or perform them. Under this light, Foucault's work can be considered as a history of norms, and one finds an abundance of historical examples of the ways in which human beings technically apply these norms to their bodies and conducts. Disciplinary technologies, the dispositif of sexuality, the mechanisms of security are clearly examples of this experience of norms seen from the perspective of normalization. However, it is in Foucault's analysis of antiquity that we find a description of our capacity to activate norms from the perspective that remained under-theorized in his previous histories of the norm, namely the element of an active and voluntary performance of norms, marked by what, in the use of pleasure, he characterizes as intentional and voluntary practices. Elsewhere, I show that the critical component of Foucault's studies of antiquity consists precisely in the descriptive procedure he mobilizes, and differently to thinkers like Pierre Hadot, for example, who sees in Foucault's genealogies of antiquity a quest for, I quote, an ethical model for modern men, end quote. I believe that one should seriously take or consider Foucault's opposition to all sort of revivalist approach. So, Foucault repeatedly says in interviews, Le Retour de la Morale, or the Genealogy of Ethics, how disgusting some of the Greek practices are, how oppressive they are in terms of the position of women. And he repeatedly tells us that the solutions that other people provided for other problems can never function as solutions for our problems. So no solutions to be found in antiquity. Similar to what Judith pointed out yesterday, I maintain that we should also take seriously Foucault's view on the historical and epistemological breaks that separate us from antiquity. There are different epistemes, there are different forms, it's a different bocal, right? And Foucault uses the ironic designation of the Cartesian moment in the hermeneutics of the subject to say that this experience of antiquity, this form of erudition and practice of self that we find in antiquity, is somehow lost to us. This experience is an impossible experience to us, right? Constituted, but impossible, of what we are, but impossible to be employed. If therefore antiquity has no fundamental exemplary value and cannot provide solutions to the problems that emerge in the biopolitical present, how can Foucault's inventorial attitude and his archive of ancient practices play a critical role with regard to normalization? How can that be? As I see it, ancient practices constitute documents, and some of you have heard me saying this before, documents for a counter history of the norm, which captures different ways of applying norms to life challenging the monolithic aspect of the present and the apparent necessity of norms. These documents, Foucault say, help us constitute a point of view, and I quote Foucault, and from this point of view, we see both the gradual long history of the formation of the norms that govern us and their contingency, as well as their dependence on the agency that institutes them. As Foucault puts it in Structuralism and Post-Structuralism, this history helps us describe what is while making it appear as something that might not be. End of quote. So in addition to producing a critical distance with regard to our historical being and the norms that configure this historical being, the inventorial procedure, while emphasizing the contingent and fragile history of norms, presents us with documents of what we could call, in the Canguilhem sense, normative activity. This activity cannot be recorded in its dynamism, but the documents do record intentional, deliberate, situated ways of applying norms to life that are different from normalization, without constituting themselves alternatives to it. And I think that is the key. So if we come back to what Foucault called his Greco-Roman trip, empty-handed in terms of norms that we should adopt, we nevertheless learn something about the contingency of present norms and the existence of a capacity to institute norms of life. Okay, the second construal, and we're getting there. I know I'm abusing of your patience, but thank you. The second construal of Foucault's critical ethos that our Canguilhemian detour allows us to articulate is what I think we could call a political art of listening. In my view, this dimension of critique can be linked to the task of diagnosis that Orazio spoke about yesterday, which considers both what we are today and the points of virtual fracture to be located in the present. And I believe that this diagnosis requires a form of attention to the social space that we could call, by making recourse to Canguilhem, as clinical. In his approach to pathology and the normal and the pathological, Canguilhem delegates to the sick person the epistemic responsibility of indicating the presence of disease. It is what Lecour called the maladie du malade that establishes a field for critical diagnosis and therapeutic action. This is because it is only the living individual in her polarized engagement with her situation and the norms of life, who can evaluate her own condition under the sign of a negative value. As we have seen, it is the impossibility of indifference for the living in relation to its own conditions of existence that is at the basis of what Canguilhem called vital normativity. And this plays out in the experience of sickness, where the very feeling of what Canguilhem calls a life gone wrong, the negative experience of hindrance, of an obstacle, appears as a normative feeling in the sense that it requires the positing of new norms. It is from within this normative position that the living being fights against disease, voices the need of therapeutic action, and opens up a territory of inquiry and diagnosis for the clinician. Therapy and medical knowledge rely on this normative position of the living being with regard to our own existence, in a way extend and unfold it. We're getting there. Analogously, for Foucault, I believe, it is the experience of social actors who suffer and resist effects of power and existing norms, which they evaluate as negative, that reveals a territory for genealogical exploration. However, rather than pathology, here we are confronted with the priority of resisting social actors who, in their struggles, evaluate the norms that govern them under the sign of negativity, excess, oppression, stagnation, normalization. This insight helps us see under a new light Foucault's claim, according to which, I quote, from Subject and Power, in order to understand power relations, we should investigate the forms of resistance and attempts made to dissociate these relations, end of quote. Through notions such as the history of the present or a critical ontology of the present or of ourselves, we can see this idea in action. So, for example, history of the present, in the introduction of Discipline and Punish, Foucault says, it is because there are people resisting the prison that I'm writing this. It is because of this process of resistance that a genealogical territory of exploration of a history of the prison is made possible and necessary politically. Genealogy, then, is not a value-free historical explanation, as Habermas characterized it, but rather finds its evaluative stance in the normative position of social actors themselves, who evaluate their own situation. Like for Canguilhem, the negative experience of sickness revealed a territory for examination, knowledge, and normative action. So in Foucault, the experience of those who suffer, resist, and rise against power reveals both a normative source for genealogy and a territory to be explored by analysis and probed in action. Habermas himself recognized this aspect of Foucault's project when he interpreted the notion of subaltern knowledges from society must be defended as having normative valence in the genealogy. And he says, in the voice and experience of those who were the first to suffer and resist the effects of power, we find a historical knowledge of struggles, which functions as a document of a lived polarity and records the concrete forms of refusal and of norms as evaluated as negative and normative responses to them. Okay, now I'll skip a bit. I know I'm over time. These situations demand, as I mentioned before, a particular kind of attention apt to perceive these different polarized experience of norms by social actors, and equipped to visualize the potential emergence of new norms in processes of insurrection and resistance. This attention or receptivity, echoing your discussion on affect with Pico before, would entail what Beatrice van Pijl called the cultivation of an ethical sensibility. And as I see, this ethical sensibility could be translated into a particular modality of listening. The cultivation of this art of listening is clear in the way Foucault defends a certain change in the economy of discourses, an inversion in the positions of speech and listening and critique. In the traditional model, the critic is the one who speaks, providing reasons for resistance and action, or positing universal normative grounds, justifying why people should act. In Foucault's perspective, the critic must be the one who listens carefully to the voices that emerge and struggles. In Truth and Power, he argues, for a long period, I quote, the intellectual spoke and was acknowledged the right of speaking in the capacity of master of truth and justice. He was heard as the spokesman of the universal, end quote. However, Foucault argues, the masses do not need the intellectual. They won't wait for the articulation of reasons by the critic to evaluate their own condition, to denounce it, or to act upon it. We're quite redundant, let's admit it. As Deleuze puts it, when faced with the processes of struggle and resistance, Foucault knows the indignity, I'll leave that for translation, the indignity, almost like the ethical problem of speaking for others. And as the initiative of the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons attests, Foucault seeks rather to pass people the word, give them the floor, allow other people to speak, donner la parole. So also a different expression to translate. Donner la parole to those incarcerated who have experiences, the concrete lived experience of the prison. And the same logic appears in other initiatives. Foucault was part of the Groupe Information Santé, the committee that he helped organizing Goutte d'Or after the assassination of a young the young Djilali, who resided in that neighborhood, mostly North African neighborhood. So all these initiatives, I think, are marked by the idea of donner la parole. This attitude of listening attentively to the eruption of the voices of the oppressed, however, is present since the beginnings of Foucault's work, and, for example, the History of Madness, where in the first preface, later excluded by Foucault, deleted from the book, hidden, one notes that the main attempt of the book was to break with the monopoly of psychiatric discourse over madness and to find the voice of the mad through an archaeology of silence. And even if this represents the process of silencing negatively, this archaeology is nevertheless critical to the extent that it seeks to listen to the voice of those whom power seeks to make voiceless, to those who have been banished from language. I'm sorry, there's a full stop here. In the 70s and 80s, however, listening does not take place in the face of the space of banishing of this great outside of voices that have been silenced, but in the mobile and agonistic space of confrontation between power and resistance. Moreover, listening, I promise I'm almost there, is not a neutral procedure, and it appears in Foucault's work also as a potential disciplinary and confessional technique. By contrast, the types of listening in question here, the type of listening in question here is not therefore one concerned with the arcana conscientiae or recording the confessional expression of desire, the articulation or disclosure of interiority. Anyway, modalities of listening that Foucault associates with the direction of conscience and in a way to psychoanalytic practices in modernity. While one listens in this modality of listening that I'm talking about here is not hidden, is not to be revealed, but is explicit. It is the voice of insurrection that speaks against power, or if you want to quote a formulation from the government itself and others, or Biko, is the voice of the weak who parrhesiastically speaks against the powerful, speaks of its injustice because this is the only thing they can do. In Useless to Revolt, 79 text engaging with a criticism regarding his enthusiasm for the beginning of the Iranian uprising, Foucault formulates this concern with the voice of the others, the voice of others, very clearly. According to him, the critic should be attentive to affirm forms of transgressive singularities that emerge in history, challenging the forms of power and government and the overdetermined coordinates of history itself. Independently of the reasons the intellectual may give, people do revolt and raise their voices against norms. He writes, no one is obliged to find these confused voices sing better than others and speak the truth itself. It is enough that they exist and that they have against them everything that is dead set on shutting them up for there to be a sense in listening to them and seeing what they mean, end quote. In this context, Foucault explained, his theoretical ethic consists in being respectful when a singularity revolts, his expression, and the imperative of listening to insurgent voices and his almost categorical defense of subversive singularity seems to be connected to what we could call, with Canguilhem, an unlocking of normative activity. When singularities break the silence or normalize the normalized forms of speech to which they have been relegated, we see not only a refusal of what is, but also an emergence of a possible inauguration, a possible new beginning. This is the conclusion. So let me conclude with a few suggestions, and this, a bit like Daniel here, this is the late night part of the paper, and there's a bit of improvisation here, so bear with me. Let me conclude then with a few suggestions for the definition of this art of listening. In addition to helping the critic identify emergent normative forces in the social space, we could also say that the act of listening itself, in addition to being a certain technology of the self that Foucault repeatedly analyzes, for example, in the hermeneutics of the subject, right, or in the government of self and others, etc., and one which demand the exercise of a certain form of application to oneself, a certain ethos, we can also say that the listening has a normative valence. Drawing on Foucault's analysis of Plutarch and the hermeneutics of the subject, we can say that this critical modality of listening has ethical and aesthetic demands, but also epistemic requirements. We could say that it entails both a practice of the self and a cultivation of certain epistemic virtues, or certain virtues epistemic conduct. And here I have in mind a few discussions, I'd like to have this conversation with them, by Daniele Lorenzini and Miranda Fricker on epistemic injustice. I think it would be nice to draw these parallels. Okay, but let me provide you this tentative list of the requirements of this art of listening. First, it is concerned with the experience of others, which takes the form of an attention to their expression. Like in Foucault's take on Seneca's ascetic listening, what is at stake is the subjectivation of a discourse, a sort of facere suum, here not of the truths of philosophy, to make it your own, not of the truths of philosophy, but to be translated into rules of life as they are for Seneca, but of the evaluations that emerge in concrete struggles. Make these evaluations your own, integrate them to your own ethos. Second, this relates to a certain political and epistemic humility. That is to say, an effort not to impose pre-established norms that would deem different emergent norms to be political deviations of a program, for example, nor discard the agent's experience of their struggles. On the contrary, this humility entails a particular attention to the knowledge that resisting social agents produce about their own situation and the oppressive modalities of government they confront. This also means the respect for singularity. This also entails the respect of the singularity of demands and voices that emerge in the social space, avoiding the idea that the critic knows better. It's not up for the critic to tell you what is the problem with your situation. The political counterpart the genealogist offers, however, is the historical work on the institutions and norms against which people fight, for the very pragmatic reasons I've mentioned before. The voices, like in Canguilhem's Maladie du Malade, open paths of investigation, and through the negative evaluations, make modalities of exercise of power visible. Third, the concern with amplifying the voices of those who denounce power, rather than seeking to ascribe truth value through theory to the demands of social struggles. So it's basically the attempt to contribute to make these demands visible using the critics or the genealogists' epistemic positionality in relation to public context of knowledge to the benefit of the demand of concrete struggles. Make them visible, not in the disciplinary way, but make them visible using your privilege as a critic, basically. Finally, this is really finally, this art of listening is fundamentally concerned with identifying a normative focus, the deployment of normative activity to be found both in the responses to the effects of power and norms experienced as oppressive, and in the forms of life that emerge in the processes of struggle. In this sense, we could turn to where we started from. If Foucault is critical of Chomsky's prescriptive approach, Daniel, this is not to undermine the possibility of social transformation or to deride, in a conservative reactionary way, transformative intentions. If prescription has potential normalizing effects, listening is fundamentally attentive to what social movements have been calling the dimension of the prefigurative, to the actuality of different norms that emerge and are embodied in the very processes of struggle, and that in a way inaugurate potential possible forms of living that are already there. They already exist in those practices. The prefigurative here wouldn't be the dogmatic imposition of political norms. There's something that is not yet, right? But the idea that the future is at stake in the very recurrent effort of social actors to break and create norms in the present and in the very norms they embody in this process. Thank you.